Welcome to the Pardes channel. Today we explain Deuteronomy chapter 14 in a clear and simple way, step by step. Now, at first glance, you might look at this chapter and think it's just a random list of ancient rules. But actually, it's anything but. It is literally the ultimate blueprint for building a highly functional, resilient, and morally grounded society from the ground up. Let's set the scene really quick so we know exactly where we are. The Israelites have been wandering through the desert for decades, and now they're standing right on the precipice, the very edge of the Promised Land. So Moses is delivering this series of final impassioned speeches. He's laying down the bedrock for how they need to govern themselves once they actually settle down and build cities. He's teaching them how to build a community that is wholly dedicated to God. And you know what that means? It means getting into the nitty-gritty, practical, everyday details of life. So here is our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to break this down into 5 parts. First, establishing the identity of a holy people. Second, the laws of land animals. Third, diving into the creatures of water and air. Fourth, we'll look at the annual tithe. And finally, we'll wrap up with the tithe of charity. All right, let's jump right into section 1. A holy people focusing on identity and mourning. It's fascinating because before Moses even mentions a word about what they should put into their bodies, he starts by talking about what they do to their bodies. Verse 1 sets the entire tone for the chapter. It says, "You are the children of the Lord your God. Do not cut yourselves or shave the front of your heads for the dead, for you are a people holy to the Lord your God." The text is making it absolutely clear. Out of all the peoples on the earth, they have been chosen. Now, if we look at the original Hebrew text here, there are 2 absolutely crucial terms we need to unpack. The first is Am Kadosh. This translates to a holy people, which essentially means a nation that is intentionally set apart for a specific divine purpose. The second word is Segula, meaning a treasured possession. Think about that for a second. Moses is establishing that because they are quite literally God's children, an Am Kadosh and a Segula, the physical boundaries of their own bodies really matter. What's super interesting here is how they established this identity. Setting physical boundaries during mourning was literally step 1 in distinguishing this community from everyone else around them. See, back in the ancient Near East, it was actually a really common cultural and religious practice among the neighboring Canaanite tribes to deeply gash their own skin or shave off parts of their hair to show extreme grief. Sometimes it was even done to appease the spirits of the dead. But for the Israelites, the pishat, which is the simple, literal meaning of the text we're focusing on today, the pishat is that their bodies belong to God, period. Because they are this treasured possession, they are given strict limits on how they can physically express their sorrow. Respecting their bodies as divine creations wasn't just a health code. It was the absolute foundation of who they were spiritually. Moving right along to section 2, laws of land animals, where we distinguish between the clean and the unclean. We are officially shifting our focus from the outside of the body to the inside. Verse 3 kicks off this section with a very clear, no-nonsense blanket statement. Do not eat any detestable thing. Boom. From there, Moses categorizes the entire animal kingdom to show them exactly what is okay to eat and what is absolutely off limits. Verses 4 and 5 list out the specific clean animals. We're talking the ox, the sheep, the goat, the deer, the gazelle, the roe deer, the wild goat, the ibex, the antelope, and the mountain sheep. But then we hit verse 6, and this is where it gets highly specific. Verse 6 gives us the biological rule for identifying why they are clean. It says you can eat any animal that has a split hoof completely divided in 2 and that chews the cud. Notice that "and." Now, just to be clear, chewing the cud means the animal swallows its food, digests it slightly in a specialized stomach, and then brings it right back up into its mouth to chew it all over again. Yeah, regurgitation. I know, maybe not the most appetizing thought when you're sitting down for dinner, but it was a crucial biological marker for them. And a split hoof just means the hoof is entirely divided right down the middle. For an animal to be considered clean, it absolutely, 100% must have both of these traits, no exceptions. This creates a beautifully simple binary system, and you can see the logic in action perfectly in verses 7 and 8. The text explicitly calls out the camel, the rabbit, and the coney, which is like a rock badger. These are unclean. Why? Because they chew the cud, sure, but they do not have a split hoof. On the flip side, you have the pig. The pig has a perfectly divided split hoof, but it doesn't chew the cud. Because every single one of these animals is missing just one of the 2 mandatory requirements, the text says you must not eat their meat. And actually, it goes a step further. You must not even touch their dead carcasses. The boundary here is absolute. So we have to ask, why does this matter so much? Well, think about it as an exercise in intense daily discipline. By making these ancient people highly mindful of every single thing they put on their plate, the ordinary, everyday habit of eating became a constant recurring reminder of their unique identity as an kadosh. Okay, let's dive into Section 3, Creatures of Water and Air. We're taking these rules and extending them to the seas and the skies. Just like we saw with the land animals, creatures living in the water have their own strict two-part physical test. Let's look at verses 9 and 10. They state, "Of all the creatures living in the water, you may eat any that has fins and scales, but anything that does not have fins and scales you may not eat. For you it is unclean." If we stick to the simple meaning here, the peshat, this means your standard common fish with scales, like a salmon or a bass, are perfectly fine to eat. But things like shellfish, crabs, shrimp, lobsters, eels, totally off the menu. They fall squarely into the unclean category. Now, if you think about the ancient world, a lot of the water creatures that don't have fins and scales were essentially bottom feeders and scavengers. They survived by eating waste off the seafloor. So once again, we see the text filtering their diet, intentionally pointing them away from creatures that are associated with scavenging, waste, and decay. Now, when it comes to the creatures of the air, things shift a little bit. Rather than giving a strict biological rule like chewing the cud or having scales, the text just hands us a highly specific list of forbidden creatures. Verses 11 through 18 tell us, sure, you can eat any clean bird, but then it meticulously lists the ones you absolutely cannot touch. Listen to the nature of the animals on this list. The eagle, the vulture, the kites, the falcon, every kind of raven, the owl, the hawk, the osprey, the stork, the heron, the hoopoe, and the bat. If you step back and look at the biology of this group, what stands out? They're almost entirely birds of prey or scavengers. These are creatures that literally survive by shedding blood and ripping into dead flesh. The community of God is being explicitly commanded to abstain from taking into their own bodies creatures that violently tear their prey apart. Right after this, verse 19 wraps up the air creatures by noting that all flying insects that swarm are unclean to you. Do not eat them. To round out the dietary laws, we hit verse 21 where Moses says, "Do not eat anything you find already dead." The simple reason here is that an animal that dies of natural causes or is killed by a wild predator hasn't had its blood properly drained. And if you look earlier in the Torah, consuming blood is strictly, unequivocally forbidden. Interestingly, the text says you can give that animal to an alien living in your town or sell it to a foreigner because they aren't bound by the specific holy covenant. But the Israelites, they can't touch it. Finally, verse 21 ends with this profoundly famous, incredibly short command. Do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. It's such a poetic yet strict boundary. It draws a stark line between life, which is represented by the mother's milk meant to nourish and grow her young, and death, represented by the slaughtered meat. And just as an interesting side note, this one single sentence is actually the foundational basis for all modern kosher laws regarding the strict separation of meat and dairy today. All right, let's move into Section 4, the annual tithe, covering economics and rejoicing. We are stepping away from the dinner plate now and looking at the wider economy in verses 22 through 27. Verse 22 gives the directive to set aside a tenth of all that your fields produce each year. So you take this tenth, this tithe, of your grain, your wine, your oil, and your livestock, and you are supposed to eat it in the presence of the Lord at the central sanctuary. But as you can imagine, verses 24 through 26 address a really massive, practical, logistical problem. What if you live way out in the country, too far away to carry heavy sacks of grain and herd a bunch of livestock across the terrain? The instruction they get is honestly brilliant. You exchange your tithe for silver. Imagine the ancient equivalent of liquidating your harvest into a portable, prepaid debit card. You tie up that silver, you travel lightly to the capital, and then you use that silver to buy cattle, sheep, wine, or quite literally whatever your heart desires. Then you and your entire household eat there and rejoice. Why? Because God wants them to experience immense, tangible gratitude. This annual tithe was essentially a mandatory savings account, dedicated entirely to funding a joyful spiritual vacation for the family so they could celebrate God's provision together. But, and this is a big but, woven right into the middle of this joyous family celebration is a crucial social mandate. You have to include the Levite. Let me explain. In the tribal system of ancient Israel, the tribe of Levi was dedicated entirely to spiritual and communal service at the tabernacle and later the temple. Because they were essentially full-time public servants, they weren't given large tracts of agricultural land to farm for themselves like the other tribes. They had literally no way to generate their own harvest wealth. So verse 27 specifically commands the community, when you feast and rejoice, do not neglect the Levites living in your towns. You absolutely must bring the landless Levite into your celebration. The practical life lesson here is incredibly relevant. It's about making sure we support and sustain those who dedicate their lives to serving the spiritual and public needs of the community. And that brings us to our fifth and final section, the tithe of charity, or the third-year safety net. We're looking at verses 28 and 29, the very closing verses of the chapter, which introduce a massive economic shift. So while the annual tithe was this really joyous, personal festival for the family to go travel and celebrate, the text asks the community to completely hit pause and alter this rhythm every third year. Let's really think about that. Instead of taking the tenth of your produce, turning it into silver, and traveling to a central sanctuary to throw a massive feast for your own household, the third-year tithe has a completely different destination and a completely different purpose. Instead of hitting the road, the entire third-year tithe is stored locally. Verse 28 says you bring all the tithes of that year's produce and you store it right there within your gates, meaning right in your own local town. And then verse 29 lists exactly who this food is meant for. It's for the Levite, the alien or stranger, the fatherless orphan, and the widow. Let's unpack exactly why these four specific groups are singled out. In an ancient agrarian economy, land ownership and your family network were your only safety nets. There was no modern government welfare program, right? The Levite had no land. The alien was a foreigner who had no ancestral family network to rely on. The orphan and widow tragically lacked the patriarchal protection and provision that was basically required to survive in that era. These were, without a doubt, the most economically vulnerable people in the ancient world. So the community's wealth was structurally designed to ensure that no one fell through the cracks. They gathered the food locally so that these vulnerable groups could simply come and eat and be satisfied. And the chapter concludes by linking this beautiful act of localized charity directly to their own future prosperity. The very last line of the chapter promises that when you provide for the vulnerable, the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. It's incredible, right? God's blessing on their future agricultural work is directly tied to their willingness to share the fruits of their past work with those who have absolutely nothing. The practical life lesson we can pull from this is profound. True prosperity isn't just about what you can hoard for yourself or stockpile for your own family. It's intricately, fundamentally linked to what you are willing to share. When we build strong safety nets for the most vulnerable among us, the entire community thrives. And ultimately, that is what makes a society truly holy. As we wrap up this explainer, we are left to really reflect on how these seemingly mundane, everyday choices regarding our diets and our charity continue to shape who we are. We've walked through this entire chapter step by step. We focused on the Peshat, the clear, simple meaning of the text. We started our journey by looking at honoring the body in times of grief, proving that they are an Am Kadosh, a holy people. We moved to the dinner plate, learning the incredibly precise rules distinguishing clean and unclean animals, the split hoof and the cud, the fins and the scales, and that poetic boundary between a mother's milk and meat. And finally, we moved to the pocketbook, seeing how this ancient economy was structured not just for personal joy and gratitude, but for deep, profound social justice for the widow, the orphan, the stranger, and the Levite. These ancient laws reveal a community where true spirituality is woven into the very fabric of everyday eating and everyday giving. Thank you for learning with us. If this helped you understand the chapter better, like, subscribe, and join us for the next chapter.